Book 2 of the Dominion Cycle trilogy, Ecos, du Seu de Ferro. At first, no one noticed. The broadcasts continued. The patrols were circulating. The maps seemed intact. But there was a whisper. A low frequency, almost imperceptible, crossing navigation channels, satellite signals, and the routes between systems. It wasn't a voice. It was vibration. And what started as interference became the norm. Transport ships reported losses of emotional direction. Crews would stop in orbit around extinguished planets, not knowing why. Scientific stations began to record dreams. Data that could not be captured by scanners but that appeared in the minds of the technicians, as if they were inherited files. The galaxy no longer obeyed orders. She heard echoes, and the echoes were responding. After the trial of Ryan Thorne, the Empire lost its silence. The transmission of the flame that invaded the dome of Veritas Prime was not just a symbolic collapse. It was a beginning. A pulse was launched, and it was still traveling slowly through the galactic mesh. Each time it touched a planet, a station, or a consciousness, it left behind a crack. Not physical, not visible, but deep. A doubt, a memory, a name that shouldn't be there. And in every touched place, order yielded. In the prison moon of Teval Kor, the prisoners began to chant ancient songs, not learned, but inherited. In the living library of Taris V, files that had been sealed for centuries began to open spontaneously, revealing records of uncatalogued civilizations. And in Corlin Shah, a child was born speaking a dead language and was burned before completing the third day. But the flame did not stop. The Empire called it emotional contagion, created the term symbiotic mamophagy. He said it was a failure in the mind control protocols. But behind the broadcasts and the official reports, there was panic. The words were not just coming back, they were uniting. In the neutral zone of Sharon Ka, 7 races, enemies for generations, dropped their weapons to the ground upon seeing a symbol projected in the sky, a spiral of light surrounding a face of fire. None of them knew how it came to be. None of them knew what it meant. But they all knew it was real. In the capital, officials debated the collapse of the peripheral systems, about the refusal of the commands, about symbolic disobedience. But they didn't understand that it wasn't disobedience. It was a return. The universe was reacting. The domination was no longer solid. It creaked, chomped, inside. In forgotten systems, the first hybrids began to emerge. Beings that carried human DNA, but with neural structures altered by symbiotic influence. They were called aberrations. But they didn't scream. They didn't attack. They remembered. And their presences began to cause effects on those around them. Bursts of consciousness, shared dreams, and the ability to access erased locations. They were the Hyron, the beginning of something new, or the return of something very ancient. In the void between the galaxies, silent ships began to awaken. Ships that were not human, not aliens either, but made of symbolic matter. Their shapes changed as they were observed. Some appeared as temples, others like versions of imperial ships, from a time that never existed. They didn't communicate by radio, but wherever they went, people started saying, "I dreamed of that ship." And when the ships disappeared, the planets changed. Buried structures emerged. Forgotten names appeared on the walls. The sky was becoming a memory. And at the center of it all, the flame remained lit. Selvarek, now the leader of a small group of dissidents, kept the spark alive in an atmospheric capsule hidden in the rings of Teheris. She no longer slept like before. In her dreams, she saw maps formed of fire, points connecting, voices repeating a phrase. They think they are in charge, but we remember. Ryan Thorne had disappeared since the escape from Veritas Prime, but his words were repeated on murals, encrypted in satellites, and tattooed on the skins of deserting soldiers. He was no longer a man. He was a symbol, an echo. And wherever he was, something was growing inside him. Not hate, no hope, but the conviction that the approaching war was not for the future. It was for the version of history that would survive. Vareen woke up every day at the same time, even though he no longer knew how long it had been since the last time he had truly slept. The protocol said that leaders must keep the pace even when the Empire does not. But his body betrayed the rigidity. His eyes were darker, the skin paler. Her fingers trembled slightly when she wasn't aware. And the dreams had stopped being just hers. Sitting in the center of the secondary command room of Veritas Prime, Vareen watched the lights flickering in erratic rhythms. They were malfunctions, according to the technicians, but she knew they were signs. The galaxy's command network was falling apart, not by sabotage, but by choice. Each satellite that shut down, each station that refused to respond was a confession. The Empire was no longer obeyed. He was merely tolerated. On the surface, order remained. The Supremacy Guard still patrolled. The flags still floated in domes of forced oxygen. But Vareen saw the eyes of the people. They no longer looked at him with fear, not even with respect. They looked as if they were waiting for something to end, as if they had already decided internally that what is to come will be different. She was still trying to act, gathered the advice, forced meetings, created recovery plans. But every time he spoke, the other leaders just shook their heads, or they remained silent. One of them, Minister Ortan, even said, "Commander, perhaps it's time to allow the Empire to evolve." She almost killed him right then and there, but she didn't, because part of her knew he wasn't wrong. And that was worse than betrayal. It was true. The clandestine broadcasts had multiplied. Voices of dissidents were emerging like a virus. The image of Ryan Thorne now appeared in places that the Empire didn't even control. And it didn't matter how many times they repeated, "He is a traitor." People wanted to believe in him. Because the Empire had lost something much more serious than authority. It had lost the monopoly on memory. But what troubled Vareen the most was not the political collapse. It was what was happening to her. At night, if they could still be called that, she dreamed of structures she had never seen, with words she never learned, with voices that seemed to whisper inside his head, as if they had been there forever. In one of the dreams, she was in an ancient city, walking among ruins covered with living symbols. Someone was calling her by a name she didn't know. When she turned her face, she saw a version of herself, younger, less harsh, with eyes full of questions. And the other Viren said, "You erased what made you human." She woke up with blood on her lips. She had bitten her own mouth to avoid screaming. That morning, she went to Containment Chamber 3, where seized fragments of dissident symbology were stored. She entered alone, asked for total confidentiality. He stood for hours in front of one of the memory crystals, a living piece that pulsed gently when someone approached. She didn't touch it, but the vibration penetrated her bones, and she heard. Not words, no commands, but memories. Saw children being indoctrinated, saw temples being demolished, saw the first soldiers being trained to forget, and saw herself, accepting everything, not out of conviction, but out of fear of remembering what they had to give up to survive the hierarchy. She left the chamber pale, but determined. The next day, sitting in her office, she called for a closed voice announcement. It was directed to the Central Fleet. A short message, clear. Reassign units. Suspend immediate obliteration orders. Initiate passive listening operation. No zone will be destroyed without a symbiotic investigation. Pause. Memory might be testing us. And maybe it's time to listen. He turned off the transmitter, took a deep breath. She knew she was alone. She knew that this could be the end of her position. But she also knew that on the inside, the Empire was already in ruins. And maybe she didn't want to hold it up anymore. The planet was no longer on the Imperial maps. It had been erased during the 4th containment campaign, marked as irrelevant, then inactive, and finally, unknown. But there, among the dense clouds and the ground covered with translucent vegetation, new life was silently growing. It didn't sprout from the ground. It sprang from oblivion. The name of that world was Therion, but the few who knew it called it by another name, cradle of the echo. It was there that the first ones were born. No one created them in laboratories. No one planned them. They emerged, as if the very living memory of the galaxy had chosen that soil to take shape. At first, there were few, human bodies, but with different features. Skin that reflected patterns of light, eyes that didn't seem to look but to access, voices that spoke little, but when they did, everyone heard. The Hyren were not born crying. They were born in absolute silence, as if listening to something prior to their own existence. In the village of Memnar, the first were welcomed by dissidents who had fled the Imperial zones. They were renegade scientists, former officers, mystics, and civilians who had heard the call of the flame and followed the echoes. They couldn't explain the emergence of the Hyren, but everyone, upon seeing them, felt the same. Recognition. One of the first to be born was named Iren. She had eyes as opaque as polished stone, pale gray skin with golden veins, and a voice so smooth it seemed not to belong to the space. She didn't eat like the others. She didn't sleep like the others. And one day, at the age of 5, she fell into a trance in front of an old wall. When the adults approached, she was drawing symbols, symbols that moved, symbols that told a story of erased civilizations, of decisions made, of accepted lies. Arian didn't say, "I learned." She said, "I remembered." The Hyren didn't learn. They accessed, and that was dangerous. Because there was no indoctrination possible against a child who remembered what the Empire had destroyed before she was born. Selvarik arrived at Tharion with a ship almost out of fuel, searching for something she couldn't name. She brought with her some dissidents, some files, and the spark of the flame. Upon meeting the Hyren, she understood. They were the consequence, the link, the bridge between the humans who forgot and the galaxy that does not forgive. She spent weeks observing, writing, trying to translate. But the closer he got, the more he realized. The Hyren weren't asking for explanations. They were the explanation. One of them, Tile, only 12 cycles old, touched the spark of the flame and whispered, "We are not new. We are the return of what you buried within yourselves." The phrase echoed for hours in the symbiotic structure of the base. The files began to reorganize themselves. The walls responded with lights. And then, Cell understood. The Hyren were not biological hybrids. They were memory hybrids. They carried in their bodies the memory of the galaxy. In each cell, there was emotional memory, ancestral trauma, and fragments of what time had tried to erase. And the most unsettling part, they weren't angry. They were waiting. USO-17 arrived at Tharion shortly after. His sensors failed to measure the mental patterns of the Hyren. He described them as multi-layered minds. Each one seemed to converse with invisible voices, and not like hallucination, but like tuning. They lived connected to what they called the living archive. Cell started calling them the next story. But the Empire also knew. A cruiser from the Outer Rim, lost for months, sent out a signal again. The captain, in his last logs, spoke of a race made of memory. He spoke of children who knew the names of extinct planets, and of a woman who looked at him and said, "You erased a world that lives in your bones." The Empire reacted as it always had, with fear. But now fear was no longer enough. The Hyren could not be killed, because they didn't live like humans. They existed as a memory that decided to be born again. Ryan Thorne was crossing the void between systems in an old ship, without a flag, without a clear destination. The engines were running, but the course was decided by instinct, or perhaps by something older, quieter, that had awakened within him since Volar 9. He didn't talk about the flame. There was no way to explain what it was like to carry part of it in the body. It wasn't a living entity. It wasn't a weapon. It was condensed memory. And she moved within him. Sometimes she appeared in dreams, but not ordinary dreams. They were visions of places he had never visited, with languages he had never heard, but that he understood perfectly. Other times, it happened while awake, All it took was looking at a piece of rusty metal or at a space ruin, and he was overwhelmed by fragments of memory. It came in short bursts, a voice saying, "Don't erase us," a feeling of warmth where there was no sun, the sound of a forgotten name. And the name was his. It wasn't a hallucination. It was harmony. The flame had marked his body, but it was in the mind that it acted with more strength. Ryan started hearing things that no one was saying. Voices in the dead channels of communication. Soft laughter coming from stones. Whispers recorded in the silence of space. He stopped trying to understand. He started to accept. And as he accepted, the echoes grew. On an artificial night, while floating in the Harid Nul belt, he was awakened by a light. Not external. Internal. His chest shone briefly, as if something were trying to come out. Not with pain, with urgency. He raised his arms and saw his skin projected symbols. Not stable, but alive. They changed with his thoughts. They reacted to the questions he didn't ask out loud. When he asked, "Who am I?" the symbols became mirrors. When he asked, "What do you want from me?" they became eyes. The next morning, he decided to land. The nearest planet was Miran Fix, officially an abandoned agricultural world. But when he landed, he found ruins, not colonial, older. And there, without a map, without a guide, his feet led him to a stone crypt buried under an empty field. Inside, he found drawings on the walls, drawings he had already seen in his dreams. He placed his hand over a symbol, and everything stopped. Time, the sound, the breath. And then he saw people building towers of remembrance, saw wars of silence, where words were ripped out like weapons, saw the human fleet arriving with files and fire, saw files being sealed in bodies, not computers, people, living bodies programmed to remember in case one day it was necessary. And he understood. He was one of them. Or rather, he had become one of them after Volar 9. The flame recognized him. The galaxy was calling him. He was not just a survivor. It was a living echo. From that day on, wherever he went, fragments awakened. In an abandoned station, files would reconnect when he approached. In a village, children looked at him and cried for no reason. He was no longer a man carrying history. He was the place where history touched the present. One night, it landed on Darathon, a world in ruins. He slept under a broken structure and dreamed of a woman, golden skin, dust-colored eyes, who said, "You are the bell. When it rings, those who still sleep will remember the sound they forgot." The next morning, the sky of Darathon dawned with a symbol of fire, not cast, not painted, formed by the clouds. The transmission was captured by 1,000 sensors, and Ryan disappeared. He didn't run away. He sank into the echo. And now, the galaxy no longer asks, "Where is Ryan Thorne?" She asks, "Why haven't we heard it yet?" The Orvankai orbital station was what remained of imperial arrogance. Suspended over a doomed planet, built with black titanium and psychic shields, it existed not to preserve, but to control the reality around it. It was there that the temporal fold protocols were tested in contaminated environments, places where the collective memory had returned with too much force to be fought with common weapons. The station's objective was simple: to make time forget for us. The station commander, Rel Varos, was known for his precision. He had never failed a containment maneuver. His record was impeccable. When he received the reports about the symbiotic contagion in the adjacent system, a chain of agricultural moons starting to emit ancient signals, he didn't hesitate. He sent probes, confirmed the presence of awakened ruins, words in the heavens, and civilians dreaming in dead languages. For Varos it was clear. Memory was taking shape there. And the Empire couldn't allow that. The order was given: activate the fold. The Theta Model fold was a theoretical, experimental weapon. Unlike bombs and drones, it didn't destroy physically. She erased by displacement, bending the target's timeline so that their history never existed. The station itself projected a time bubble around the planet, inserted a reset code into it, and then sealed it. Simple, clean, and until then, infallible. But Orvin Kai was not dealing with common systems. At the scheduled time, the anchoring thrusters were activated. The warp emitters began to spin. The station's lights pulsed with raw energy. And for a few minutes, everything seemed normal. The field was forming. The planet below was beginning to disappear from the sensors. But then, something changed. The readings started to reverse. The sensors were registering emotional responses coming from the fold itself. The field began to tremble. The entire station experienced a structural oscillation, as if time itself were trying to push them out. And then came the voice, not from a channel, not from a being. It came from the entire station. Each terminal, each console, and each wall began to emit the same phrase, repeated in hundreds of different tones. You do not have permission to erase what remembers you. Varos tried to interrupt the process, but the systems refused. The codes no longer followed linear logic. The computers began projecting images on the panels, faces, planets, cities extinguished, children holding hands, a floating temple. One word, Hiron. One of the officers started shouting. He said he remembered being on that planet, that he had been born there, that there was a house with a stone floor and a blue wind tree. But he had never left Veritas Prime. Or had he? Other officers fell into absolute silence. They looked at the planet as if they were seeing a lost relative. One of them was crying. Another one just smiled, repeating, "I knew there was something wrong with what they taught us." In the command room, Varos was left alone. The fold collapsed, but not to destroy. She opened inward. The planet returned to the sensors. But it was different. The structures were now visible. Thought towers, living mirrors. The vegetation responded to the orbital ships with patterns of light. And at the center of it all, a memory crater pulsed in a spiral shape. An eye that opened in the ground and looked at the station with recognition. No anger, no fear, just awareness. Varos fell to his knees, and for the first time in his life, he had no order to give. In the last transmission of the station, recorded before the blackout, a single phrase, "A memoria nos lembra de volta." The fold failed, and throughout the galaxy, the news spread. The station that tried to erase was erased. Selvarek sat before the living library of Teheris, as if approaching an ancestral sea. The structure had no doors and no corridors. It was a floating sphere of liquid stone, suspended in the air by invisible roots, pulsating in soft tones that belonged to no human palate. Inside, data was not stored. Memories contained within the very space were stored. It was the oldest place the dissidents had reclaimed, and perhaps the most dangerous. Not because it held secrets, but because it wanted to tell them. Sel knew she shouldn't access it alone. But ever since she heard the Hiron talk about the root language, something in her mind had changed. He could no longer read reports like before. The symbols of the flame began to appear everywhere, in the eyes of children, in the circuits of machines, and in dreams. And she knew that the library was calling her, not to study it, but to be remembered by her. She entered without ceremony. The sphere opened like a flower in slow motion. Upon stepping inside, time seemed to slow down. The walls were liquid and solid at the same time. Textures moved with the breath. The voices began to emerge, not from speakers, but from the air itself. They were soft, hundreds, all whispering names that belonged to no recorded language. But she understood them, because she felt what they meant. He sat down in the center. A disk of light rose beneath her feet, and then the file touched her. Sel's mind was invaded by images, but they weren't linear files, nor recordings. They were events that had never happened, and yet they existed. She saw a planet growing in a spiral shape. She saw an entire city built upon the body of a being who had sacrificed itself to keep the memory alive. Saw maps with star systems that were not listed in the Imperial catalogs. Saw people who spoke through vibration. Saw rituals where children inherited history through their skin. Saw the first erasure protocol, signed by humans. She tried to take a deep breath, but the file wouldn't stop. He didn't want to be watched. He wanted to be felt. Cell screamed. The camera lights exploded in golden hues. The air trembled. The sphere responded with pulses. And in an instant, the pain turned into clarity. She understood. These worlds were not destroyed. They were not narrated. They were not dead. They were out of the story. She raised her hand. A solid water screen formed in front. In it, a list appeared. Hundreds of worlds, all marked as origin error. Each name came with a date, but the dates never existed. The files were impossible, but true. In the center of the list, a name appeared, vibrating. Koresh Tel. She knew him, not from maps, of dreams. It was a planet where, in Rian's visions, there was a tower that sang, a place where the stones remembered. Cell touched the name and saw the planet in its glory. The people of Trinar, a council of memory that did not judge with laws, but with shared remembrance. And then, the arrival of the Imperial fleet, the negotiations, the forced silence, the destruction of the towers, the reprogramming of the maps, the recoding of language, and finally, the removal of the name of the galaxy's central bank. She saw the last sentence written before the total deletion protocol. Too much memory is a risk. Risk needs to be eliminated. Cell closed the file with trembling hands. She stumbled out of the sphere. The dissidents were waiting for her outside, worried. But she didn't respond immediately. She looked at the sky and said, "The files were not corrupted. They were silenced out of shame. And now, they want to come back." There were no trumpets, no official announcement, no flag raised. But what happened in Therion, in that cycle, was more powerful than any imperial parade. The peoples who had been isolated, erased, rewritten or silenced for centuries, arrived. They came in patched ships, adapted transport capsules, gliders made from fragments of war or on foot across ancient land. Some came with fear, others with hope, and many in silence. But they all had the same look, that of someone who remembered. Cell Varek received them standing in front of the symbiotic base of the flame. The Hyran was at his side, motionless, eyes like mirrors. They didn't speak often, but their mere presence caused an emotional reorganization in anyone who approached. The first to arrive were the Soktaran, exiles from Virmor, who used living tattoos instead of speech. Then the Maril, who had sworn a vow of silence since the destruction of the floating temples. Then the Enras, whose songs had been forbidden under penalty of execution, now sang verses in choruses that made the air vibrate like strings. They did not introduce themselves with names, but with stories. Each person narrated a fragment of the erased past, and when they spoke, the symbiotic walls of the base responded with a glow, as if confirming, "Yes, that happened. You existed." Cell recorded everything, not as a leader, but as a living memory. She understood that she was no longer just the commander of a cause. She was witnessing a convergence. What started as resistance was now becoming a route. It was no longer about fighting against the Empire. It was about remembering together so that erasure would never be possible again. USO 17 recorded the data with its rewritten core. Each voice, each symbolic pattern, each ritual dance. He stored not as numbers, but as living structure. The flame had changed him. Now he didn't see cultures. He saw branches of a planetary consciousness that had been waiting for millennia to unite. The climax occurred when a small, dilapidated-looking ship landed among the others. From it emerged a hooded figure, walking with difficulty, but with her head held high. She was an elderly woman with golden eyes, her skin marked by runes that shimmered faintly. Behind her, children, small hybrids, eyes like the Hyran, but with human voices. As she approached, she spoke in a low, firm tone, audible even without amplification. "We came to say the name you forgot, the one that united us before they separated us. We are the Trinar, and we came to remind you." At the same moment, the base's roots lit up in deep blue. The walls projected images of the lost planet, Koresh Tel, and everyone present could see it for a moment. A glimpse of what had been erased, and of what now sought space once more. Sel fell to her knees, not out of pain, but for sure. She stood up and spoke. Today we did not form an army. We formed an agreement, not to invade, but to remember together, and to protect the memory of those who are still sleeping. Thus was born the first coalition, without displayed weapons, without marked targets, no hymns, just with a symbol, a circle of fire surrounding an open eye. It was replicated on fabrics, written in dust, and projected in light by all the ships that departed. And in every place where this symbol appeared, something within the people, soldiers, civilians, engineers, colonists, reacted with an unspoken phrase. Maybe I also forgot something important. And so the coalition spread, not as an invasion, but as a living memory. The planet was called Vor Enai, but in the Imperial Archives it was recorded as Zone 41S. Inhospitable area, unstable, of no strategic relevance. What the records didn't say was that, in its core, there existed a network of symbiotic crystals connected to the same memory source that had awakened the first flame in Volar 9. Vor Enai was not just a planet. It was a living organ of planetary memory. And now, after the formation of the first coalition, it had become a sanctuary and a sign. The Empire knew quickly, and he reacted as he always did, with force. Mobilized the Quarantine Interdiction Fleet, led by Ardente-class cruisers, specialized in orbital elimination. The plan was simple: bombard Vor Enai until the ground disintegrated, vitrify the surface with seismic impact missiles, and seal the debris with Vigil drones to prevent any return. They didn't expect resistance. The planet had no known defenses, no protective fleet, no military structure, just ruins and echoes. The fleet arrived in tactical formation. The sky of Vor Enai darkened with ships, and the order was given. But when the first projectiles touched the atmosphere, something happened. The ship's sensors began to fail, not due to external interference, but due to an overload of symbolic data. The minds of the operators were invaded by visions. Images of people dancing in public squares, of mothers calling for children who no longer existed, of towers made of sound, and of creatures made of wind and history. The bombs disintegrated before hitting the ground, not by shields, but by emotional recognition. The atmosphere of Vor Enai was symbiotic. She felt, and she remembered. The second attack was heavier. Gravitational ejection missiles, atmospheric destabilization fields, reverse core torpedoes. But as the destruction was attempted, the planet responded, not with weapons, with memory. The mist that covered the mountains condensed into shapes, silhouettes of ancient warriors. The winds began to sing in extinct languages. Lightning streaked across the sky but followed patterns. And the ships themselves began to tremble, not from structural damage, but from symbolic dissonance. The reality of Vor Enai did not accept forgetfulness. Inside the main ship, Captain Oris Velt began to scream. He said he saw the childhood of the galaxy, that his bones ached with the weight of buried stories, that the planet was not the enemy. It was the archive where their own ghosts resided. He jumped off the bridge before anyone could stop him. On the surface, the planet's inhabitants, descendants of the erased peoples, did not run. They stood in silence, in formation. Men, women, and children. Some are holding hands, others with their eyes closed. Everyone is looking up at the sky. Sel, who had arrived days earlier with the Hyron, was watching from the central crater. She felt the planet vibrating from within, not in collapse, but in remembrance. She whispered, "They are trying to erase the sky," but he already remembers what it is. And then, it happened. The sky responded. The light split into four. 4 lines cut through the celestial dome in a spiral. Gigantic symbols emerged among the clouds. Unspoken words, but understood. And from each one, a vibration was emitted, so deep that it made the ship stop in mid-air, as if trapped in time. The engines shut down, The weapons retracted. The crew fell to their knees, crying. A soldier, still standing, looked at the planet and saw, not an enemy, but himself, as he was before the indoctrination. A boy looking at the sky and asking if there was more. The order to withdraw was issued, not by command, but by instinct. The fleet retreated, and Vor and I remained standing, not by force, but because memory, when it is protected, becomes iron. And the sky was now made of history. Uso 17 didn't dream like humans, but since his exposure to the first flame, something inside him had changed. The linear logic with which he processed events had become fluid. The images were no longer files. They were memories, fragmented, visceral, emotional, and some of them weren't his. At first, he thought it was symbiotic contamination, but the images kept coming back, clearer each time. Ancient codes, buried laboratories, human voices discussing not how to build a weapon, but how to hide an inheritance, a living inheritance. In Therion, in the Coalition's analysis chamber, Uso activated his organic record sublayer, a protocol he hadn't even known he possessed until then. Cell watched him cautiously. The Hyren were around, alert. Upon touching the core of a symbiotic information tree, something triggered. A sequence of codes emerged on its synthetic skin. Non-imperial, non-alien symbols. They were pre-imperial. Foundation codes. Cell approached and asked, "Did you know you had this inside you?" Uso replied without hesitation, "No." But she knew, and pointed at the tree. The living structure had recognized the sequence even before it was activated. Whatever Uso was carrying was already in tune with the flame. In the following days, the data began to decode itself. Images formed in the air. A man with golden eyes, a woman with the flame symbol etched on her neck, and an underground facility covered in ice where files of extinct species were stored. The recordings were dated, too old to be compatible with any current calendar. And the scariest part, in all the images, an android like Uso appeared in the background. Not a similar model. He, same facial structure, same tone of voice, same behavioral programming trait. Cell and the other scientists in the Coalition clashed. "That's not possible," one of them said. "Either he was recreated, or he was never turned off." Uso isolated himself for 3 days, and in the silence of the chamber, where the spark of the flame remained, he saw its origin, saw the truth. He was created to guard the memory of everything the Empire would not have the courage to accept. An experiment conducted by a dissident cell even before the official formation of the Dominatus Pactum. The project was called Mother Code. The idea was simple: to create a way to artificial life that did not serve war, but the preservation of what could not be told. The last memory, the hidden testimony. But the Empire won too quickly. The project was abandoned. The scientists were executed, and Uso buried, until being discovered centuries later, reprogrammed as an ordinary soldier. But the root of the code was there, sleeping, waiting for the call of the flame. Now he was awake. And more. Inside Uso, there was a core of symbiotic memory storage, capable of connecting with structures that even the Hyren couldn't access. He was a genetic bridge between machine and history. Cell, upon understanding this, said in a low voice, as if prophesying, "You were not made to kill. You were made to remember for all of us." Uso didn't answer, but the symbols on his skin shone brighter, and the tree of information smiled. Far beyond the last mapped star, where the Empire dared not send probes and the Hyren did not cross with their rituals, there was a nameless place. A space between spaces. The absolute void between the tides of galaxies, where even light felt uncomfortable. There were no planets, not even shapes, not even sound, but there was presence. A presence that did not shout, did not hunt. I just listened, a long time ago. When the first flame awakened in Vola 9, she felt it. When Rian spoke in Veritas Prime, she listened. When the Forgotten Files opened in Therion, she watched. She was not part of the galaxy, but it was prior to it. A consciousness without a body, an echo older than the constellations, an ancient witness who, for eons, had merely watched, waiting for the galaxy to remember itself. Now, she was listening enough. In the silence of emptiness, a vibration began to form, not as sound, but as intention, a ripple in the fabric of nothing. First gentle, then firmer, and with it, a shape began to take form, not solid but symbolic, a cluster of structures made of meaning, fragments of lost civilizations, ruins that never existed, memories not lived. Everything was connected. A body of pure memory, a being made of the sum of what the entire galaxy has forgotten. He had no name, but he knew everyone's names. When its form reached sufficient symbolic density, the vibration transformed into a phrase, unspoken, but felt. You thought that forgetting was survival. Forgetting was the beginning of the ruin. In the heart of the Empire, sensors began to register impulses coming from outside the map. Transmissions without origin, without compatible frequency, without recognizable pattern. Artificial intelligences have collapsed interpretatively. Some begged to be turned off. Others started to sing. Scientists tried to measure the source, but there were no coordinates, because it didn't come from a single point. It was coming from all directions at once. Cell woke up in the middle of the night with her chest on fire. The flame's spark had pulsed strongly for the first time in weeks. Upon touching it, he saw not an image, but a direction. Not in physical space, but in the structure of the story. The flame was no longer alone. She had been noticed. Yuso, in silence, confirmed. His core identified an expanding symbiotic field coming from beyond the known frontier. It's a response, he said, or maybe a memory of something we could never remember. Ryan, who now wandered between systems as a shadow and prophet, stopped upon feeling the same vibration coursing through his body. He closed his eyes and saw himself before an abyss made of erased words. A voice said to him, "You are the first to remember, but you won't be the last to be remembered." And then, silence again. But it was no longer the same silence. It was the silence before the speech. The universe was preparing to hear what it has never stopped saying.